Good evening, Shakespeare students. Welcome once again to our video lecture. This evening, we will be focusing on The Tempest. Before I start talking about the play, I'd like to just mention a couple other quick things. I've been slightly disheartened looking at the analytics on the video viewing from last week and realizing that a fairly large percentage of you have not viewed the videos in their entirety. I'm aware that we are in a rather unusual situation, and I'm also aware that a number of students in the class are having their own difficulties due to whatever set of circumstances they are confronting on their own. But nevertheless, it feels like there's been a pretty marked drop-off in participation from when we first migrated to the online format. And the forum was relatively lively, and there seemed to be some sense of exchange, and I feel like that has suffered a little bit. I'm aware that probably some of that has to do with the kind of the ongoing nature of the quarantine and the pandemic, which takes a psychological and emotional toll on everyone, that's for sure. And then there's the added fact that many of you are working on your term papers, and obviously working on the term paper might take priority over watching videos or whatever else that might be associated with the class. I'm realistic, I understand what's going on, but I hope that we can at least salvage some level of the interactive part of the class going forward. Now, we only have 2 more class periods left. Tonight we'll be, as I said, we'll be looking at The Tempest, and I'll give a lecture on that, and then I will have a Zoom question and answer period starting at 7 o'clock this evening. So hopefully you'll have a chance to watch this in advance of that, and then we can get together and talk a little bit about the play. And then next week we will have our class on Tuesday. Since the Margaret Atwood interview was canceled, I figure it makes more sense to move our class period back to Tuesday evening. And so I will do another module on comparing The Tempest and Margaret Atwood's Hagseed, which you should read for then. And I will also post a series of questions for the final exam. Now, as I said, a number of you have communicated with me about your ongoing struggles with respect to the term essay assignment. I'm aware, believe me, I'm aware that there's a lot of stress out there in the world, and adding your term paper to it is a big, there's a big load there. I've spoken to a number of people about extending the deadline, and as I've said previously, and I'll reiterate that here, I don't have a problem if you need more time to finish the essay. I would heartily encourage you to try to finish it by next Tuesday, which would be April 14th. The reason being that on next Tuesday, I will post the questions for the final examination, which will be turned in the following Tuesday, the 21st. And so if you extend the time that you take to write the term paper, you're going to be taking away from your time to prepare the final exam. So with that in mind, unless there are some extreme extenuating circumstances, I would recommend that you try to finish it by next Tuesday. But if you do not have it to turn in at this particular moment in time, don't sweat it. You don't need to write me a message explaining what's happening unless there's something especially extenuating that you feel I need to know about. But in general, if you need another week, you can have it. That goes for all of you. Those of you who have been turning the papers in advance of the due date, I have been trying to make progress on the grading. And so because of the nature of the way things are now, as I grade them, I am simply returning them to you on an individual basis. So those of you who have turned in your papers early, because I didn't have too many other ones to grade, I've been able to get ahead on that. Assuming that tonight a good number will be turned in, I might slow down a little bit, but as I finish the grades, I write my comments and I write my grades and I just send it back to you. So you can submit the essays just via email. If you can send them as an attached document on an email to my institutional UDaval email, that would be the preferable way. And if it can be a Microsoft Word file, that would also be the preferred mode, not PDF, and certainly not screenshots, which sometimes people send to me, which are just really a pain to deal with. So yeah, a Word document, I can then fit the comments into the text very, very easily. And as I said, I can turn it around relatively quickly so that you should have your copy back shortly thereafter. So we can get started now on our discussion of the play. The play, as I said, that we're looking at this evening is The Tempest. It's frequently thought of as Shakespeare's last play. However, that's probably not true. There was at least one play written, Henry VIII, after The Tempest. Now again, there's questions of authorship and etc. and chronology as well. But it does appear that there was at least one play written after The Tempest. But The Tempest appears to have been produced in 1611, which certainly puts it near the end of Shakespeare's dramatic career. Shakespeare died a few years later, 5 years later, in 1616. And so, of course, the fact that he is getting old plays heavily in some of the themes present in this play. The play is, generically speaking, a romance. And there's a series of late plays in Shakespeare's career, Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest, that are collectively known as the late romances. The romances are kind of curious because they combine both tragic and comic elements. They were sometimes referred to as tragic comedies, but then basically they have a certain difference about them. Romance is a natural step going beyond the human experience after tragedy. Tragedy usually involves choices that can't be reversed, which lead to the tragic conclusion. In romance, sometimes it feels like things are fungible, reversible, and people get second chances and fresh starts and things like that. Tragedy is typically dominated by fate and fortune. And in romance, the destiny at the heart of the plays tends to come from divine providence. Typically, tragedy deals with alienation. As we talked about earlier in the semester, tragedy is usually the operation of the isolation and alienation of the tragic hero. And romance is typically defined by reconciliation and restoration. So it has, in a certain sense, there's a lot of similarity with comedy, right? And you'll notice, certainly in this play, you'll notice that thematically speaking, the issue of weddings and that sense of an ending that occurs here is pretty much in keeping with some of the situations from comic drama. So some of the characteristics of Shakespeare's romances include typically an enveloping conflict, a war, a rebellion, treachery, or intrigue that usually has a large time span. You probably noticed in this play that there's a lot of activity. It's what's known as, it deals with the play en medias res, that it begins in the middle, and we know all these things that have happened previous to the dramatic action of the play. Typically has a happy ending with an apparent or potentially tragic set of circumstances. There's very often improbability, much like in some of the comic plays. You have surprises, rapid action, extraordinary circumstances, shipwrecks figure very, very heavily in this genre. Characters are typically of a high social class, and there are rural and court settings, and typically they involve love. So in a certain sense, they have a lot of similarity with comedy, but they tend to have a bit more of a hard edge to them, perhaps a potentially tragic edge. And so, as I said, this play has at its sort of an essential episode of the play, something that happens 12 years outside of the dramatic frame. And we're dealing with the usurpation of Prospero's dukedom by his brother, and the fact that he and his daughter Miranda were set adrift on a ship, and they float towards this island. And so this is a play that has, once again, the protagonist of the play has this quality that we can see very closely associated almost with something like the playwright himself. Prospero is a figure who is, either a dramatic figure. He's obviously a magician, but he seems to have this quality of creator and stage director that we've seen on a number of occasions in the semester. If you remember back from the beginning of the term, where the character of Richard III is portrayed in that way. Now, as Shakespeare gets older, the association between this character and Prospero is once again an old man. He's a bit like King Lear in a certain sense. And in fact, you could argue that there's some level of culpability in the same way that Lear bears some level of responsibility for his problems, his dilemmas. Prospero may have some level of culpability as well. There may be some reason to believe that he was too absorbed in other things, in esoteric things, and not preoccupied enough with the day-to-day duties of his ducal responsibilities. And this opened the door for the usurpation of his dukedom. As I said, he's an old man, and Shakespeare, the playwright, is also an old man. This is one of the reasons why people like to view this play. I think it was considered for a very long time as Shakespeare's last single-authored play, because we wanted there to be this opportunity, his farewell to the stage, and it was this kind of cultural fantasy that the playwright wants to say goodbye to us, and we want him to say goodbye to us. So that sort of held true. Similarly, one of the dominant themes of the play is mortality, and so we have both the mortality of Prospero, who seems to be preoccupied, and intimations of mortality and immortality throughout the play. As I said, Shakespeare dies 5 years after the play was first staged, so that kind of weighs into the picture as well. The play's kind of compact for the romances, as I mentioned in talking about the genre of romance. Usually those plays are kind of sprawling, and particularly temporally. They, in the way a comedy and a tragedy usually have a kind of compact nature, particularly tragedy. Aristotle spoke famously of the unity of tragedy, and one of the unities was time, that has to be relatively condensed in time. And typically you're getting into the story right at almost the precipitous moment where the actions that the tragic hero takes start to bring about his fall, and it happens relatively quickly. This one's obviously compact in time. It's compact in place. It has basically a single setting, and it's relatively compact also in its dramatic personnel, which, as I said, all of those things are kind of at odds with some of the traditional aspects of romance. So I guess one of the key things in considering this particular play is sort of a rich interpretive tradition related to it. The classic mode that this play was seen of had to do with the idea of Renaissance humanism, and Prospero was this figure of the artist, playwright, magician, man at the center of the universe, man as creator and as authority. And so, Prospero is this figure who is unifying the world around him with his so potent art. Now, one of the other issues here is that we're once again dealing with the supernatural, the magical realm. And again, we've seen this in a number of plays, most notably, Macbeth would be the obvious one, where there was this supernatural presence that seemed to have a bit of a malevolent side to it. The witches, the weird sisters, were not. When we talked about that play, we talked a little bit about James I's preoccupations with witchcraft and demonology and things like that. And there's always been a sort of a religious element to that. Prospero doesn't seem to be a malevolent figure. In fact, when we think of his magic, it's kind of good, we might call white magic, that has a positive element to it. And in fact, he is contrasted with other figures in the play who seem to have that, less positive air about them. Most notably, Sycorax, the mother of Caliban, who was also a witch, and she's portrayed to us in sort of less flattering terms. She seems to be derided, and we could see her as a figure of malevolence within the play. Now, Prospero is effective at subduing her and her child, Caliban, right? Both of them are sort of slightly anarchic figures within the play. And so Caliban, with the use of his magic books, is able to thwart these, revolts against his authority, both high and low. And we see it here with these two, and we see it with the other interlopers who end up on the island later on, that he is able to bring them to heel and ultimately to extract a form of revenge for those who have been responsible, right? Because his dukedom was usurped, and him and his poor daughter were set adrift at sea, left to their devices, right? So, and in a certain sense, this curiously, we talked about this generically as being a romance. This has many of the qualities of one of the revenge tragedies as well. If you think of the circumstances, the most famous of them being Hamlet, right, where Prince Hamlet is setting out to avenge the murder of his father, and he needs to find out whether his uncle Claudius, you see this pattern repeatedly, right, with these family members, duplicity within the family structure. Here, Prospero has a motive for revenge. We'll probably talk about this topic a bit more next week. I don't know to what extent I'll address it in the lecture today, but when you read Margaret Atwood's Hagseed, keep in mind the parallels. That's a novel that is constructed in response to The Tempest, and it has it's a contemporary setting to it, but the major themes that the Tempest addresses are taken up by Atwood, and revenge becomes one of the big ones, and sort of how you want to pursue your revenge. We see Prospero plotting this, but then he seems to be turned from a hard edge on that as we near the end of the play. I'm not sure what you thought as you're going through the play, but perhaps as we reach the end of it, it's, I don't know if I would say surprising, but that he doesn't seem to desire it quite as much, right? Maybe he's gotten what he wanted. And so in a sense, it of course is not a tragedy, and precisely because rather than seeking to extract whatever he can to get that sense of vengeance, he seems to move more into the role of a forgiver. And so that becomes a central element. And, we've seen that too. We talked about this earlier in the term, where the tragedies and the comedies don't differ that much from one another. If you think of, As You Like It, or if you think of something like Midsummer Night's Dream, the circumstances at the outset are possibly onerous. If the people pursue what they claim to want to pursue, and people are intransigent, the ending will not be a happy one. Comedy tends to diffuse that tension and let it go somewhere else. So once again, we have a play that, as I said, starts out with an element of disorder. In this case, the disorder lurks in a distant past, really. The situation with Prospero and his dukedom was something that occurred a long time ago, 12 years before. But that sense of the usurper, the idea that we have an interloper who has taken liberties. And if you think about it, throughout the entire semester, we can almost see it across the board, right? In each of the plays we've studied this semester, you have this issue of fitness to rule, rightness to rule, which obviously, if we think of Shakespeare's time, in particular the end of the Elizabethan era into the early Jacobin era, the preoccupation in England with who was going to rule and how the rule was going to proceed was a very prominent one. And so it makes sense, in As You Like It, you have the two dukes arguing and disagreeing over who gets to rule, and Duke Frederick taking the rule unrightly from his brother. Richard III, the entire story is pretty much of him moving everybody out of the way for his passage to the throne. Obviously, Macbeth, we have that in spades, a regicide where you kill the king, and that's almost the very definition of a usurper. And even in King Lear, we can kind of see it to a different extent, where Lear willfully abdicates his throne, but he doesn't quite realize what he's signing on for, and he doesn't quite realize the nature of the people that he has abdicated in favor of. And so he ends up regretting the choice, but there's that element is there throughout. So here we have, again, a deep past, and Prospero has been forced to accommodate himself in a different way. And of course, he's still a ruler. There are elements of Prospero's character that there are a number of questions we have to ask, because it seems that he bears some level of responsibility. He opens the door, let's say, to his brother Antonio taking his rule from him, and it's because he's too preoccupied with these esoteric affairs, his books and things like that. And of course, when he's cast out and put on the boat with young Miranda, he takes his magic books with him. So it almost feels as if he has made a certain choice, and he has determined that the responsibilities that go with his job as the Duke were not necessarily priority one to him. Again, we can see a similar parallel perhaps with Duke Vincenzo in Measure for Measure, where he also the responsibilities of rule, in particular the sort of the hard-edged part of it, where you have to be the good cop, bad cop kind of thing, where you have to be the one who hands down the rules that people don't necessarily want to hear about, was not so fun. And so Vincenzo abdicates in favor of Angela, lets him be the bad guy, and he goes and hides and wants to take credit for other things. Prospero didn't seem like ruling was his thing. As I said, he's associated very much with this idea of the artisan, the magician, the Renaissance man, accommodated with arts and crafts. Then he takes over this island, and of course he imposes his will there. And this is really where the second dominant reading of the play, and perhaps the most prominent, more recent reading of the play, has to do with kind of a post-colonial reading that comes out of our sense of Prospero's attitudes on the island. And most particularly, that has to do with the contrast that's brought forward with his attitudes about his two servants. So the two servants, Ariel and Caliban, are very, very symbolic embodiments, right? The mind and the body, the imagination and desire. So Ariel is this image of imagination personified, whereas Caliban is something closer to libido or sexual desire or id, the basic human drives that we need. Ariel is associated with fire and air, Caliban with earth and water. And of course, Prospero we're dealing with this sort of sense of the scientific man, right? And so this almost the union of these two, they're aspects of humanness, right? And the parts of our existence that are the baser and the higher natures. And we see Prospero with a strong connection to alchemy and to science. And that was definitely connected to the idea of knowledge. And this really, there is an element of this that comes back to that Renaissance humanist reading that I was talking about, where mankind is a creature just a little bit below the angels, caught between the bestial and the celestial. And Prospero can be seen in that way, standing between the two poles marked out by Ariel and Caliban. And that was, again, the way that the play was read. If you look into the criticism on the Tempest, you'll see a whole bunch relating to humanist ideologies. One of the things that makes Shakespeare great, or that enabled Shakespeare to achieve the kind of greatness that he had, I think, is precisely because of the time that he was writing. And so, humanism became this break with some of the attitudes that typified the Middle Ages, and this opening up of spirit where the potentiality of man became the be-all and end-all. And Shakespeare was fortunate enough to be writing at that time. And so the plays, I believe it's the great and recently deceased critic Harold Bloom, who wrote a book called Shakespeare, The Making of the Modern. And he talks a little bit about how precisely that interface with Shakespeare writing at that time starts to create these characters that are the reason why he is so appreciated and so recognized even 400 years later, is that the characters are very modern, even though, we're talking from the late 1500s, early 1600s. People like Hamlet and, many of these characters, you can see it in Prospero, you can see it in other characters in the plays. They have these very recognizably modern attitudes and desires and priorities. And so that's a product, certainly, of the time. Now, let's see here. Now, of course, the other big issue, which is another aspect of the time, is that at the beginning of the 1600s, England is just about to embark on its colonial expansion that will ultimately make it the most powerful nation on earth a few centuries later. It's already started, right? If you look at the history of the 16th century, there's a whole lot related to the control of Ireland. And Ireland was this close colonial possession. And during the time of Queen Elizabeth, there was a whole bunch of tenant farming, and the Irish were seen as these, debased, wild people. They were beneath the English, and they were, considered lesser. They were typically, villainized. And now, of course, in the beginning of the 1600s, this is precisely, right in the midst of the age of discovery, right? And so the idea of the New World, Columbus having sailed in 1492 and opening up these ideas about the New World, and the French and the Spanish and the English and other groups traversing the Atlantic and having these interactions, right? Probably the most prominent early British colony in the Americas was Jamestown, which is in Virginia, in the beginning of the 1600s. And this is before the play was written. And so you have a number of figures that, kind of relate to this. There was an awareness. You've seen it. It happens in a couple of Shakespeare's plays, where you have these kind of passing references to things that probably allude to this other vaguely unknown world. It's kind of interesting to think about, right? Because you have the Americas as this entity that people are aware that it exists, but it's kind of still taking shape in a collective imagination. One of the key texts for studying this book would be an essay by Michel de Montaigne, a French writer from around the late 1500s, called Of Cannibals, that was translated by John Florio into English in 1603. And Shakespeare was very clearly aware of this text, and it figures heavily in some of the things he writes in the Tempest. And so Florio's translation of Montaigne's Of Cannibals, as I said, was a seminal text, a central text that Shakespeare clearly made use of during his construction of the Tempest. We can actually see it in a speech that I'm going to look at in a few moments, where Gonzalo is talking about the Commonwealth and about his idea of ruling the island. The thing about this interaction, which is kind of funny, the essay of Cannibals actually comes from Montaigne's collection called Essays. If you think of the origin of the French term essai, to try something, and the concept of the essay really begins there. It's a small treatment of an attempt to encapsulate an idea. And so Montaigne writes about cannibals, and he sees the New World people. Now, he hadn't been to the Americas, but he had heard secondhand of people's interactions with these tribes in the Caribbean and in South America that were primitive in the eyes of the humans, in the eyes of the Europeans. Excuse me, that's a very bad Freudian slip. Where these people who didn't wear clothing, and they had these habits that were completely other, completely foreign to us. If you want to talk about culture shock, there you have a really serious early example of culture shock. And yet Montaigne, in the essay, kind of sees them, even though it's entitled Of Cannibals, and of course with cannibalism we think immediately of consuming human flesh, which obviously is a taboo and has a very, very negative connotation. But there's kind of this connection to a pastoral vision of this enlightened, almost the noble savage concept, that these people, these primitive people, were also sort of protected from some of the problems of society, right? Hundreds of years later, Freud writes Civilization and Its Discontents, and he talks a little bit about kind of the price we have to pay for getting together and being civilized and being a community that coexists in the way that we do, but we have to make a whole bunch of sacrifices. And certainly Montaigne in the 1500s was writing about these aspects of the society. I'm going to read a speech. This is from Act 2, Scene 1, where Gonzalo is talking, and there's this weird subplots in the play, and Gonzalo is this kind of noble, intelligent, wise old man, and you have Sebastian and Antonio, and then you have Trinculo, and so you have these characters kind of traversing the island and creating this sort of a chaotic scene a little bit, trying to make their way. And Gonzalo is talking a little bit about his idea of what the islands would be like. As I said, this is Act 2, Scene 1, starting at line 147. In the Commonwealth, I would by the contraries execute all things, for no kind of traffic would I admit, no name of magistrate. Letters should not be known, riches, poverty, the use of service, none, contract, secession, born, bound of land, tilth, vineyard, none, no use of metal, corn or wine or oil, no occupation, all men idle, all, and women too, but innocent and pure, no sovereignty. And then Sebastian and Antonio interject, yet he would be king on it? And Antonio replies, the latter end of this commonwealth forgets the beginning. And Gonzalo continues, all things in common nature should produce, without sweat or endeavor, treason, felony, sword, pike, knife, gun, or need of any engine. Would I not have, but nature should bring forth of its own kind, all foison, all abundance, to feed my innocent people. It's a really beautiful speech, and actually if you take the time to go look at Montaigne's essay, the Florio translation, there are pieces of that that are almost verbatim. It's kind of a paraphrase, an extended paraphrase of what Montaigne is talking about in the speech, in the essay, excuse me. And he's talking about this place, this innocent, naive place. As I said, when we talked about pastoral in our discussion of As You Like It and the images behind pastoral poetry, typically we have this Edenic attitude, right? The idea of Arcadia or Eden, these idyllic places where preceding man's fall, and there's cooperation, and there's no need to work. You sort of saw that alluded to in some of Gonzalo's lines there. And so you have this kind of utopian, almost communist quality to it that is, of course, at odds with, you see Sebastian and Antonio, who are, of course, characters who were not meant to be terribly sympathetic to. They're the usurpers plotting the overthrow of the murder of Prospero, and they've already they've already colluded in the usurpation of his dukedom. So they're not the most positively seen figures in the play, and they're kind of critiquing Gonzalo's statement of this place. And Gonzalo tends to have as I said, a sort of a wise old man who sees things in a different way. Now, of course, this is once again coming. This play is late in Shakespeare's career, and he is voicing some interesting ideas here that may have been slightly iconoclastic. But in fairness, Shakespeare is frequently iconoclastic in what he addresses here. So, but again, coming through this period of discovery and this idea of almost the first contact with these native peoples. The Montaigne's essay is entitled "Of Cannibals." It's actually a derivation. The word cannibal is derived from Carib. Carib was a relatively fierce tribe in the New World that were feared. Basically, they were fairly violent, and of course the derivation of cannibal, which is someone who eats human flesh, comes very quickly from that. Now, the purposes for the play, Shakespeare has obviously brought that essay into his discussion through Gonzalo's speech, but there's also the character of Caliban, and Caliban is an anagram of cannibal. The character of Caliban is the place where we really start to see that extended, what we would call a post-colonial critique, and that has, as I said, starting in probably the mid to late 20th century, was the place where criticism of this particular play frequently went. So with the movement to the Americas, with this establishment of colonial domains, quickly came these contacts with the native people, the people who were living in the Americas at the time. Interestingly, the first colony, Jamestown, which is part of what's now the state of Virginia, named after the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth, and Jamestown, named after the contemporary king, King James, was established as a place. Basically, there were people going there with sort of financial endeavors, and that's what the English colonial enterprise ends up becoming, by and large. In the Americas, certainly this first colony ends up expanding, and it becomes an agricultural place. It kind of begins actually the foundations of the transatlantic slave trade in the Americas, which the South is very closely associated with that. You want to keep in mind that when this slave trade took hold, starting in the 1619, so a few years after this period, if I'm not mistaken, is the first commerce in human slave trade. That's where it happened, in Virginia. And so these places are, have at their heart this economic endeavor. They became plantations, largely eventually growing cotton in the Caribbean, which was also British colonial domain. They were associated with sugarcane. And then you had the other large colony in the Americas, which was the Plymouth Bay Colony, Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that was set up 20 years later, 1620, so 10 years later, I believe. And that was actually done for religious reasons. And that sort of foreshadows a lot of the religious tumult that's going to happen in the coming years, resulting ultimately in the English Civil War. And so the Plymouth Bay Colony was founded by Puritans who were escaping England, where there was a fair bit of religious persecution, and they were looking for religious freedom. They were relatively zealous Christians. And so, of course, when you go to Massachusetts, you have all the legacy of that, blue laws, and, where you can't buy things on Sunday, and you have this very historically, traditionally very rigid, conservative Protestant Christian attitudes. In England, there was a fair bit of upheaval. The 1600s were a very tumultuous century, as we mentioned previously. In the time after Shakespeare's death, the theaters end up being closed down eventually, mostly for this religious zealotism reasons. And so it's a messy period in time. But coming back to the Virginia Bay Colony, where we start having these first interactions with native people, the things that we associated often with Thanksgiving, right, where there's an exchange and some kind of back and forth, relatively benevolent, benign. At least that's the way we like to portray it. People on the other side of that equation might not see it that way. And so the figure comes up again and again when we see this play, situating it at the time that it comes from, and a number of references, right? There are a number of just small passing references in the play that make us make the connection to the New World, whether it's a New World play or an Old World play. There are actually compelling arguments for seeing it both ways. There's references to the still vexed Bermuda, which are the islands off the coast in southeastern United States. Again, alluding to the journeys of people. There are actually tracts of, I believe, Walter Raleigh and a couple other people going to the Virginia Bay colonies and talking about these storms off the Bermudas and things like that. Obviously, the play seems like it has a European context as well, because in the context of the play, the people who end up getting shipwrecked are coming back from the wedding of Claribel in Tunisia, in Africa, and they're on their way returning back presumably to Italy. So they're crossing the Mediterranean in principle, but the island that we find ourselves on is it's kind of a palimpsest. It's a fictional island, and the post-colonial reading took on a whole lot of steam, I think, in the 20th century. You want to keep in mind the play is 400 years old, but in the early 20th century, you had a number of people who started to gravitate towards this idea of the play being an interaction, a first encounter of these different civilizations. And so Prospero interacting with Caliban is seen as European civilization and societies having their first awareness of these American people, these First Nation American people. Starts in the early 1900s. An Uruguayan philosopher by the name of Jose Enrique Rodo wrote something called Ariel in 1900, and then El Mirador de Prospero, or Prospero's Balcony, in 1913. And in those works, he calls upon Latin American cultures to try to maintain their own set of values, unsullied and separate from kind of the materialistic ones that were starting to be defined in the early 20th century by the United States. Certainly you have probably the most famous one. It's a Martinican playwright, Aimé Césaire, who published In Tempest, which was a radical adaptation of the play in 1968, created for black theater. and you have a Cuban revolutionary intellectual, Roberto Fernandez Retamar, who wrote a work called Caliban in 1971. And in all of these works, Caliban tends to be reimagined and reconceived as a much more central figure to the play, and also a much more sympathetic figure in the play. And of course, that's kind of complicated because the play gives us fairly good reasons to question Caliban's personality. Now, at the end of the play, Prospero famously says, this thing of darkness I acknowledge mine. This thing of darkness, it's kind of a curious phrasing, right? And certainly if you want to be critical of Shakespeare's use of language and attitudes, I don't know to what extent we want to hold, what account we want to hold him to from the perspective of, the early 1600s. But certainly race and racial awareness would be something very, very different then. There was not that much. There were blacks living in England. There was actually a small community of blacks at the time. But we've seen it again in Othello and in other works where awareness of race is kind of a complicated one. And certainly racism existed and exists. And the play seems like there's a bit of a judgment on on Caliban. And of course that judgment comes because our dominant perspective is Prospero's. And if I were to ask you the question, why do we have such a negative impression of Caliban? I'll give you 3 seconds to think about that. Caliban is very quick to try to rebel against Prospero's authority. But of course, you could argue, being enslaved by him. I mean, he's being used, both Ariel and Prospero are being used, for labor. And they're basically, they're they don't have full agency and full freedom. Now, interestingly, Prospero seems to be a bit more indulgent with respect to Ariel, and by the end of the play, when Ariel is making the case for his freedom, Prospero seems to be a bit more accepting of that. Now, of course, there's one big episode that lurks in the background with respect to his attitude about Caliban, which is that Caliban has tried to rape his daughter Miranda, and so much of Prospero's attitude and sense about who Caliban is. I believe I've been mixing the names up a little bit. If that's the case, I do apologize to you. But if Prospero's sense of who Caliban is, and our sense of who Caliban is largely defined by Prospero's. And of course, we've seen it previously where Prospero's statement about Caliban's mother, Sycorax, and she's portrayed as this blue-eyed hag and this this figure, again a malevolent figure, perhaps a figure associated with magic, but not necessarily the benevolent magic that Prospero has. Now, the post-colonial readings suggest that the master gets to define the narrative, and so the slaveholder gets to determine who's he gets to tell the story that he wants to tell. Now, very often there's another story waiting to be told that doesn't get the chance to be told because the person with the power takes up all the space and usurps or hijacks the narrative. And so when you read post-colonial criticism on this play, and as I said, that's probably the dominant mode of criticism on this play in the last certainly in the last 20, 30 years. There's a lot to be said about that. So in the end, Prospero's attitudes about both Caliban and Ariel are shown to be lacking in empathy. Let's say that he doesn't seem to be fully aware of what he's done and what he has done. Now, you could argue that by the end of the play, his attitude has softened and has changed. He basically, after having set out to pursue an elaborate revenge scheme on the people who have taken his dukedom, he seems to have a softening turn at the end. And certainly the way the play ends suggests that he has grown, in a sense, and he has come to realize something else. It's kind of an interesting aspect of the romance, the romantic aspect of the play. And so the ending of the play has this kind of bittersweet quality to it. I mean, Prospero has sort of abdicated his power. He has drowned his books, and he's ready to go back to Europe now. And then, of course, we have the beautiful epilogue of the play, spoken by Prospero. If you remember, the last time we saw an epilogue was with Rosalind speaking at the end of As You Like It. And here, as I said, frequently for many, many years, viewed as almost Shakespeare's farewell to the stage. Prospero speaking outside of the frame of the play. Now my charms are all overthrown, and what strength I have's mine own, which is most faint. Now 'tis true I must be confined by you, or sent to Naples. Let me not, since I have my dukedom got, and pardoned the deceiver, dwell in this bare island in your spell, but release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be received by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgences set me free. As I said, that served as a beautiful coda to Shakespeare's dramatic career. Prospero standing on the stage asking for recognition from the audience. And it said Prospero as a stand-in for Shakespeare has a beautiful richness and a beautiful symmetry to it as well to end the play. Next week, we're going to be speaking about Margaret Atwood's Hagseed, and I think there will be plenty of room for us to continue thinking about some of the themes that we've vaguely addressed here, but maybe that we have sort of just skirted a little bit. Hagseed is a curious work because it's the story of a theater director who is run out of his post and is kind of done a bad turn by people underneath him, much like the relationship of Prospero and Antonio in the play. And then his fall from grace, Felix Phillips is the theater director, and his fall from grace is kind of complete. And so he needs to figure out a way to make a comeback. And the way he makes a comeback is by taking over the direction of an educational program, a theatrical educational program in a prison, in a correctional institution. And so he ends up staging a version of the Tempest in I believe it's the Fletcher Correctional Facility or something like that. And he has these inmates working to create the production, and he works with them. And you have this very beautiful and elaborate paralleling story. It's the story of staging a production of The Tempest, but you have many of the themes of The Tempest spilling out into the work. And obviously the idea of the prison setting is quite loaded, because in this particular play that we're looking at, the dynamics of power are one of the crucial elements that one needs to think about. So I'm going to finish up the lecture here. We will have a Zoom conference call at 7 o'clock this evening that you are welcome to partake in. We can address questions. There will be discussion questions posted on the portail that you're welcome to have a look at. and there will be other issues we can address as well. I believe I mentioned at the outset, I'll reiterate, if you are finished with your term paper and you would like to turn it in, please feel free to do so. However, if you are not finished, and a pretty large number of you have suggested to me that you're struggling to finish on the schedule that we originally agreed to, you can certainly have an extra week of time to finish up the essay. If you can get it to me by next Tuesday, April 14th, that would be ideal, because at that point I will post the questions for the final examination. So if you have any questions, you can certainly feel free to raise them in the Zoom conference call. If you guys want to put your cameras on so I can look at you, that would also be wonderful. If you're still too shy about that, I can live with it as well, but whatever. So hopefully I'll speak to some of you quite shortly. Have a good evening.